Welcome to 10 Chapters Audiobooks. Stories that are short enough to finish, deep enough to feel.
Silverthorn Murderers. Chapter 1. The Thorn in the Garden. The train groaned to a halt, the screech of its brakes cutting through the stillness of the fog-shrouded station. Miles Harrington stepped onto the deserted platform, his polished leather shoes making a faint tap against the wooden planks. The air was thick, clinging to his coat like an unwelcome shadow, and the faint glow of a street lamp did little to pierce the veil of mist. Harrington adjusted his trench coat and glanced at the letter in his hand. The words penned in Sheriff Briggs's unmistakably terse script. Need your expertise. Urgent. Blackwood Station, Friday. The message had been delivered with no further details, but Miles wasn't a stranger to cryptic summonses. In his line of work, such brevity usually meant trouble, and trouble was what Harrington was best at solving. A figure emerged from the fog, his silhouette broad and deliberate. Sheriff Briggs, dressed in a heavy jacket and wide-brimmed hat, carried the kind of presence that demanded attention. His face, worn with years of toil, bore the faint lines of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little about it. "Detective Harrington?" Briggs greeted, extending a hand. His voice was low and gravelly, a perfect match for his weathered appearance. "Sheriff," Harrington replied, shaking his hand. The grip was firm, no nonsense. "You've got a body, I take it?" Briggs nodded, his lips pressed into a grim line. "A body and a whole lot of questions. You'll see soon enough." They walked together toward the waiting patrol car, their footsteps muffled by the fog. Harrington took in his surroundings, the empty station, the distant outlines of small buildings, the suffocating quiet. Blackwood wasn't just any small town. It was the kind of place where silence was more than an absence of noise. It was a presence, heavy and unsettling. "Not much crime out here, I take it?" Harrington asked as they climbed into the car. Briggs gave a short, humorless laugh. "Not the kind that makes headlines. Couple of drunks causing trouble now and then. Petty thefts. But murder?" He shook his head, starting the engine. "Not like this." "And by like this, you mean?" Harrington prompted. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You'll see when we get to the Calloway place." The drive was short but uncomfortable, the patrol car's heater doing little to combat the chill that seemed to emanate from the town itself. As they wound through the narrow streets, Harrington noted the way the fog seemed to cling to everything. The rooftops, the lampposts, the faint outlines of trees. The town felt like it was holding its breath. The Calloway estate loomed large at the edge of town, its wrought iron gates standing like sentinels against the night. The house beyond was grand but cold, its windows reflecting the faint glow of the moon. Harrington could see why Briggs had called him. Places like this didn't just attract wealth, they attracted secrets. Briggs led Harrington through the gates and into the garden, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The roses were immaculate, their petals shimmering with dew. But it wasn't the flowers that caught Harrington's attention. It was the body sprawled among them. James Calloway lay on his back, one arm outstretched, the other clutching a gleaming silver thorn. His eyes, now lifeless, stared up at the sky as if searching for answers he hadn't found in life. The thorn, polished to perfection, was unnaturally smooth, its metallic surface catching the faint light. Harrington crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. "How long has he been like this?" "Found him about 10 hours ago," Briggs replied, his voice quiet. "Wife says she heard something in the garden around midnight. Came out to check and, well, you see the rest." "Any signs of a struggle?" Harrington asked, lifting the thorn carefully from Calloway's grip. The inscription etched along its surface caught his eye. "The truth blooms in shadows." Briggs shook his head. "None. No defensive wounds, no footprints except for Mrs. Calloway's. It's like he just died." Harrington frowned, studying the thorn. "This isn't random. Whoever did this wanted to send a message." Briggs lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. "That's not the half of it. This isn't the first time we've seen one of those things." Harrington's gaze snapped to the sheriff. Go on! 2 months ago, another body, different part of town, same thorn, same inscription. Didn't think it was connected at the time. Briggs exhaled a stream of smoke, his face shadowed. Now I'm not so sure. You should have called me then, Harrington said, his tone even. Briggs didn't respond, but the guilt in his expression was answer enough. Inside the Calloway mansion, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and something faintly metallic blood, perhaps, or the sharp tang of tension. Eleanor Calloway was waiting for them in the parlor, her figure framed by the firelight. She was a striking woman, her black dress accentuating her sharp features and dark eyes. She held a teacup delicately, though her hands trembled just enough for Harrington to notice. Detective Harrington, she greeted him, her voice smooth but devoid of warmth. I assume Sheriff Briggs has told you about my husband. He's told me enough, Harrington replied, taking a seat opposite her. But I'd like to hear it from you. Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the fire. I don't know what there is to say. I heard a noise in the garden last night. When I went to look, I found James like that. Her voice faltered, but she quickly composed herself. He didn't have enemies, Detective. He was a good man. Good men don't end up dead in their own gardens holding silver thorns, Harrington said bluntly. Was there anything unusual about his behavior recently? Anything out of the ordinary? She hesitated, her composure cracking just slightly. He was preoccupied. There were phone calls, letters. He wouldn't tell me what they were about. Harrington leaned forward. Do you know where he kept these letters? His study, she replied reluctantly. Upstairs, second door on the left. Thank you, Harrington said, rising to his feet. I'll try not to disturb anything. Eleanor didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the fire. Calloway's study was a mess of papers, books, and the faint scent of tobacco. Harrington sifted through the clutter with practiced efficiency, his eyes scanning for anything that might provide a lead. A locked drawer caught his attention, and he pulled out his pocket knife to pry it open. Inside, he found an envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was neat, almost too perfect. Harrington unfolded the letter carefully. James, the petals are falling. You know what this means? Prepare yourself. The truth blooms in shadows. Harrington frowned, his mind racing. He folded the letter and slid it into his coat pocket, his attention shifting to the stack of photographs beside it. One in particular caught his eye. 3 men standing in front of a building labeled Blackwood Social Club. Calloway was on the right, smiling confidently. In the middle was another man, older, with a reserved expression. And on the left was someone Harrington didn't recognize, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Back in his hotel room, Harrington laid the thorn and the photograph on the desk. His notebook lay open beside them, its pages filled with sketches and notes. The inscription on the thorn gnawed at him. The truth blooms in shadows. He picked up the photograph, studying the 3 men. Calloway, Harold Vance, the first victim, and the unidentified man, the Blackwood Social Club. The pieces were there, but the puzzle was far from complete. Harrington leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the foggy street below. Somewhere out there, someone was orchestrating this. Someone who wanted these men dead and had gone to great lengths to make their deaths a statement. The truth was buried in Blackwood, and Harrington was determined to unearth it thorn by thorn. End of Chapter 1. The Silverthorn Murderers, Chapter 2. Shadows in the Fog. The morning came reluctantly to Blackwood, dragging a blanket of fog through the narrow streets. The sun fought for prominence in the gray sky, but barely managed to cast a pale glow. Miles Harrington stood outside the diner, his coat pulled tight against the damp chill. Inside, the smell of bacon and burnt coffee wafted out with the opening of the door, mingling with the crisp air. Sheriff Briggs was already there, hunched over a plate of untouched eggs and a mug of steaming coffee. "Morning," Harrington said, sliding into the booth across from Briggs. "Detective," the sheriff replied, his voice low and rough. "You sleep?" "Not much," Harrington admitted. Couldn't get that Thorn out of my head. Briggs grunted. Join the club. Harrington took out his notebook and flipped to a fresh page. Let's talk about the first victim. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, stabbing at his eggs with his fork. Harold Vance, local school teacher, found dead in his home 2 months ago. No signs of a break-in, no struggle. Just him in his chair, like he'd fallen asleep. And the Thorn? Harrington prompted. Right there in his hand, Briggs said, his gaze fixed on the window. Same inscription, same. Everything. Cause of death? Harrington asked, his pen poised. Strangulation, Briggs replied. No fingerprints, no fibers, nothing. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. Harrington leaned back in the booth, his mind piecing the puzzle together. 2 victims, 2 Thorns, a school teacher and a businessman. On the surface, they seemed unrelated, but the identical modus operandi said otherwise. Did Vance have any connections to Calloway? Harrington asked. Briggs scratched his chin. Not that I know of. Vance kept to himself. Quiet guy, never made trouble. But they knew each other, Harrington pressed. Everyone knows everyone in towns like this. The sheriff sighed. Yeah, they'd cross paths now and then. Fundraisers, town meetings, that sort of thing. And what about the Blackwood Social Club? Harrington asked, watching Briggs closely. The sheriff stiffened, his fork pausing midair. What about it? Vance and Calloway were both members, Harrington said, sliding the photograph across the table. I found this in Calloway's study. Briggs examined the photo, his jaw tightening. That was years ago. The club's been gone for ages. Gone, maybe, Harrington said, but not forgotten. What do you know about it? Briggs hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. It was a group of the town's elite. Business owners, the mayor, a few others. They kept to themselves. Rumors started swirling about shady dealings, corruption, nothing I could prove. And the man on the left? Harrington asked, pointing to the figure in the hat. Who is he? Briggs shook his head. Never met him. Could be a visitor, could be a member who kept a low profile. Harrington tapped the photograph with his pen. This isn't random. Whoever's behind this is connected to that club. The Calloway estate felt different in the daylight. The garden, once eerie under the moonlight, now looked almost serene, as if the roses were oblivious to the violence that had occurred among them. Eleanor Calloway greeted Harrington at the door, her appearance as immaculate as the day before. But there was a new tension in her posture, a brittleness in her voice. Detective, she said, leading him to the sitting room, have you found anything? Not yet, Harrington admitted, taking a seat, but I need to ask you more about your husband, specifically his connection to Harold Vance. Eleanor's expression remained calm, but her eyes betrayed her surprise. Harold? I don't see how they could be connected. They were both members of the Blackwood Social Club, Harrington said, watching her closely. Eleanor's composure faltered. That was years ago. James hardly mentioned it. He said it was just a group of men who met for drinks and conversation. And nothing more? Harrington pressed. She hesitated. He stopped attending before we were married. He said the club was falling apart. Did he ever talk about why? Harrington asked. No, she said quietly, but I could tell something about it bothered him. There were things he didn't want me to know. Harrington nodded, filing the information away. Do you recognize this man? He handed her the photograph, pointing to the figure in the hat. Eleanor studied the photo, her brow furrowing. No, I don't. But if James knew him, he never mentioned it. Thank you, Harrington said, rising to leave. If you think of anything else, let me know. Eleanor nodded, but her expression suggested she was already holding something back. Dr. Walter Greaves's house sat at the edge of Blackwood, hidden among the trees. The driveway was overgrown, the house itself modest but well kept. Harrington knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness. The door opened slowly, revealing an older man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. Detective Harrington, Dr. Greaves said, as if he'd been expecting him. "Come in." The interior of the house was a stark contrast to its exterior. Books lined the walls, interspersed with strange artifacts that gave the space an almost museum-like quality. Greaves gestured for Harrington to sit in a worn leather chair. "I assume you're here about the murders," Greaves said, settling into a chair opposite him. "Two men, two Thorns," Harrington said, "and both connected to the Blackwood Social Club." Greaves nodded, his expression unreadable. That club was a mistake. It brought together men who had no business being in the same room. "Why's that?" Harrington asked. "Because power corrupts, Detective," Greaves said simply. "And those men had power. Too much of it." "And what about you?" Harrington asked. "Were you a member?" "I was," Greaves admitted, "but I left when I saw what it was becoming. It started as a place for camaraderie, for discussing the future of Blackwood, but it turned into something darker." "Darker how?" Harrington pressed. Greaves hesitated, his gaze distant. "Let's just say there were secrets, deals made in the shadows, and some of those secrets were worth killing for." "Do you think these murders are connected to those secrets?" Harrington asked. "I know they are," Greaves said, "but whoever's behind this isn't just killing for revenge. They're sending a message." Harrington leaned forward. "Who's the man in the hat?" He handed Greaves the photograph. Greaves studied it for a long moment. "I don't know his name, but I remember him. He came to one of our meetings. He wasn't from Blackwood, but he seemed to know everything about us." "And you don't know why he was there?" Harrington asked. "No," Greaves said, "but I remember one thing. He said he was looking for justice." Harrington left Greaves's house with more questions than answers. The fog had thickened again, wrapping around his car as he drove back into town. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel under his tires. The photograph and Greaves's words weighed heavily on his mind. Whoever the man in the hat was, he wasn't just a visitor. He was the key to the entire puzzle. And if Greaves was right, he wasn't finished yet. Harrington parked outside the sheriff's office, his mind already racing ahead to his next steps. The truth was out there, buried in the shadows of Blackwood, and he was going to uncover it, one thorn at a time. End of Chapter 2. The Silverthorn Murderers, Chapter 3, The Petals Begin to Fall. The scent of damp earth lingered in the air as Harrington parked his car outside the Blackwood Library. The building was an imposing structure of stone and iron, its Gothic arches giving it the appearance of a cathedral dedicated to knowledge. Harrington had spent the morning combing through the sparse records at the sheriff's office and found nothing of substance. If the Blackwood Social Club held secrets, they weren't going to be found in neatly filed reports. He pushed open the heavy doors, the faint creak of the hinges echoing in the cavernous lobby. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes magnified by thick glasses, looked up from her desk. "Detective Harrington," she said, her voice soft but firm. News traveled fast in Blackwood, and it seemed everyone knew he was in town. "What can I help you with?" "I'm looking for anything related to the Blackwood Social Club," Harrington replied, offering her a polite smile. "Old records, meeting minutes, membership lists." The librarian pursed her lips, tapping her pen against the desk. "The social club hasn't been active in years. Most of the records were donated to the town archives, or so they claimed." "And what about rumors?" Harrington asked. "Anything unusual that might not have made it into the official records?" The librarian's gaze sharpened. "You mean like the whispers about what they were really doing? Deals behind closed doors, favors exchanged, people silenced? That kind of unusual." "That's exactly what I mean," Harrington said. The librarian studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me." In the dimly lit archives below the library, Harrington sorted through dusty boxes labeled with faded handwriting. The librarian had left him to his work, muttering something about not wanting to stir up old ghosts. Most of the boxes contained mundane records budget reports, event flyers, photographs of town gatherings. But one box tucked away at the back of the room caught his attention. Its label read simply, Private correspondence. Harrington opened the box, his heart beating a little faster. Inside were letters bound neatly in bundles by year. As he flipped through them, one envelope stood out. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same deliberate, elegant script as the letter he'd found in Calloway's study. Harrington carefully unfolded the letter, the faint smell of old paper rising as he did. James, you've betrayed the Petals. The cost is steep but necessary. The truth blooms in shadows and your secrets will not remain buried. Prepare yourself. No signature, no clear sender. But the tone was ominous enough to make Harrington's skin crawl. He scanned the rest of the box, pulling out other letters with similar handwriting. Each carried the same cryptic warnings, each addressed to different members of the Blackwood Social Club. Harrington's mind raced. Someone had been watching the club for years, documenting their secrets, waiting for the right moment to strike. But why now? And why Calloway and Vance first? He pocketed the letters and closed the box, his thoughts interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps echoing above. Someone else was in the library. Back upstairs, Harrington found the librarian back at her desk, her expression tense. Someone was just here asking about you, she whispered, leaning forward. Who? Harrington asked, his voice low. A man, tall, wearing a dark coat and hat. He didn't say much, just wanted to know if you were here. I told him I hadn't seen you. Harrington's stomach tightened. The man in the hat. He nodded his thanks and left quickly, scanning the street as he exited the library. The fog had thickened again, muffling the sounds of the town. He couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He climbed into his car, gripping the wheel tightly. If the man in the hat was following him, it meant he was getting closer to something that person didn't want him to find. The drive to the next address on his list was tense. Harold Vance's house sat on a quiet street lined with identical bungalows. The home had been vacant since his death, but Harrington had arranged with Briggs to gain access. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door creaked open to reveal a home frozen in time. Vance's living room was tidy, almost sterile, as if no one had ever truly lived there. A bookshelf stood against one wall, its contents neatly arranged. Harrington scanned the spines, looking for anything out of place. One book, its title worn away with age, caught his eye. As he pulled it off the shelf, a folded piece of paper fell to the floor. Unfolding it, Harrington found another letter, its words sharp and biting. Harold, you are complicit, whether by silence or by action. The petals fall for all who nurtured the garden. Prepare for the thorns. Another cryptic warning. Another piece of the puzzle. Harrington tucked the letter into his pocket and continued his search. In the small desk by the window, he found a journal. Flipping through the pages, he discovered Vance's neat handwriting, each entry precise and concise. Most were mundane notes about school events, personal errands, but one entry, dated 3 days before his death, stood out. James came to see me today. He's worried. Says someone is watching us, leaving notes. I told him to go to the police, but he refuses. Says it's too dangerous. He mentioned the social club, said we'd all made mistakes. But this was different. I don't know what he means, but I'm starting to feel uneasy myself. Harrington closed the journal, his pulse quickening. Calloway and Vance had both known they were targets, yet neither had sought help. Whatever they'd been involved in, it was serious enough to keep them silent, even in the face of death. As Harrington locked the door behind him, he noticed a figure at the end of the street. A man in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat stood still, watching. Harrington's breath caught, but he forced himself to remain calm. He turned casually and walked to his car, refusing to glance back. He could feel the man's eyes on him the entire time. Once inside the car, Harrington started the engine and pulled away, his mind racing. The man in the hat wasn't just a phantom. He was real, and he was following Harrington's every move. Harrington's next stop was the mayor's office. If the Blackwood Social Club had truly been as influential as Greaves suggested, the mayor would know more. Mayor Thaddeus Langley was an imposing man, his office filled with plaques, photos, and a faint air of arrogance. He greeted Harrington with a forced smile. "Detective," Langley said, gesturing to a chair, "what brings you to my office?" "I'm investigating the murders of James Calloway and Harold Vance," Harrington said bluntly, "and I understand you were a member of the Blackwood Social Club." Langley's smile faltered. "That was years ago. The club doesn't exist anymore." "But the consequences of its actions do," Harrington said, leaning forward. "Calloway and Vance both received threats before their deaths. I've seen the letters. Someone is targeting members of the club." Langley's face darkened. "Detective, the social club was nothing more than a gathering of like-minded individuals. We discussed town planning, shared ideas. Whatever happened to James and Harold has nothing to do with the club." "Then why are you so nervous?" Harrington asked, his voice cutting. Langley hesitated, then sighed. "There were indiscretions, business deals that weren't entirely above board. But that's all in the past." "Not for whoever's sending the thorns," Harrington said. "Do you recognize this man?" He showed Langley the photograph, pointing to the man in the hat. Langley's eyes widened. "He came to one of our meetings, said he was an investor, interested in funding some of our projects. I never trusted him." "What was his name?" Harrington pressed. "I don't remember," Langley said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I remember the way he looked at us, like he already knew everything." Harrington stood, slipping the photograph back into his pocket. "If you remember anything else, you know where to find me." Langley nodded, but his expression suggested he wanted Harrington as far away as possible. That evening, Harrington sat in his hotel room, the letters, journal, and photograph spread out before him. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. The Blackwood Social Club had sown something dangerous, and now the thorns were coming for the harvest. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke his concentration. He moved to the door, peering through the peephole. A shadow passed by, slow and deliberate. Harrington opened the door, but the hallway was empty. The man in the hat had been there. Harrington was certain of it, and whoever he wasn't finished yet. End of Chapter 3. The Silverthorn Murderers, Chapter 4. The Garden Secrets. The fog clung to the town like an old habit, refusing to dissipate even as the day dragged into early afternoon. Harrington sat in the sheriff's office, his notebook open on the desk in front of him. The room smelled of stale coffee and damp paper, and Briggs was pacing, a habit Harrington had noticed when the man was particularly agitated. "This guy's a ghost," Briggs said, rubbing the back of his neck. "No name, no prints, no witnesses, just these damn thorns and a trail of bodies." "He's not a ghost," Harrington replied, tapping his pen against the notebook. "He's real and he's methodical, but he's also leaving clues, breadcrumbs for us to follow. The question is, why?" Briggs stopped pacing, his brow furrowed. "You think he wants to be caught?" "Not necessarily," Harrington said, leaning back in his chair. "But he's definitely sending a message. The thorns, the inscriptions, the letters, they all point to the social club." Briggs muttered something under his breath. "I told you that club was trouble." "You did," Harrington agreed, "but I need more. Who else was involved? Calloway, Vance, the mayor, Dr. Greaves, who else?" Briggs frowned, his gaze drifting to the floor. "There was one other name that always came up. Albert Mayfair. Owned a few businesses in town, restaurants, a lumber mill, that sort of thing. He kept his nose clean as far as I know, but he was close with Calloway." Harrington jotted the name down. "Where can I find him?" Briggs hesitated. "You can't. He died 5 years ago. Heart attack." "That doesn't mean he's out of the picture," Harrington said. "Sometimes the dead have the loudest voices." The Blackwood Cemetery was as dreary as Harrington expected, its weathered headstones leaning against the relentless pull of time. He followed the narrow path, his eyes scanning for the Mayfair family plot. When he found it, the headstone was simple, unassuming. Albert Mayfair, 1942-2019. Beloved husband and father. But it wasn't the headstone that caught his attention. It was the fresh bouquet of roses lying at its base. The petals were bright red, a striking contrast against the gray stone and muddy ground. Harrington crouched to examine them. A card was tucked neatly into the bouquet, its edges damp from the dew. He pulled it out, his heart sinking as he recognized the handwriting. Harrison and Albert. Even the dead cannot escape the thorns. I find them, the gardener. Harrington felt a chill run through him. This wasn't just about the living members of the social club, whoever the gardener was. They were holding the dead accountable too. He glanced around the cemetery, the fog muffling the world around him. Was someone watching? It was impossible to tell. Harrington pocketed the card and made a mental note to have Briggs run the name, the gardener, through any old town records. It was likely a pseudonym, but every name had a story, and stories led to answers. Back at the hotel, Harrington spread his findings across the desk. The letters, the photograph, the journal. Each piece added another layer to the puzzle, but the full picture was still unclear. He turned the card over in his hands, the words echoing in his mind. Even the dead cannot escape the thorns. The gardener. It wasn't just a moniker, it was a metaphor. The thorns weren't just symbols, they were tools of judgment. And the gardener? A self-styled executioner. Harrington's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He stood, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver holstered at his hip. Who is it? It's Eleanor Calloway, came the reply, her voice sharp with urgency. Harrington opened the door and Eleanor swept inside, her coat clutched tightly around her. Her composure was gone, replaced by a raw edge of fear. I received this, she said, thrusting an envelope toward him. Her hands trembled as she let go. Harrington opened it, scanning the letter quickly. Eleanor, the petals fall faster now. You've been sheltered by the garden, but it will not protect you forever. Prepare yourself. I find them, the gardener. Sheltered by the garden? Harrington asked, looking up at her. What does that mean? I don't know, Eleanor said, her voice rising. I've told you everything I know about James, about the social club. I was never part of it. But you were connected to it, Harrington pressed. As James's wife, you must have known more than you're letting on. Think, Eleanor. This could save your life. She sank into the chair by the window, her eyes darting around the room. There were whispers. James never spoke to me about the club directly, but I overheard things. Arguments late at night when the men met at our house. They mentioned deals, money changing hands, threats. James seemed scared, but he wouldn't admit it. What kind of threats? Harrington asked. I don't know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But there was one night I remember it because it was the only time I saw James truly terrified. He came home late, disheveled, muttering about someone named the gardener. He said they knew too much, that they had to be stopped. And he didn't elaborate? Harrington asked. No, Eleanor said. He just poured himself a drink and locked himself in his study. I never saw him like that again. Harrington leaned against the desk, the pieces clicking into place. The gardener wasn't just watching, they were part of the club, or at least close to it. Someone James and the others knew personally. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. Do you think I'm next? Harrington hesitated. I think you're in danger. But if the gardener wanted you dead, they wouldn't have sent a warning first. There's still time to figure this out. As night fell, Harrington found himself back at the sheriff's office, poring over old case files with Briggs. The gardener's name hadn't appeared in any official capacity, but there were hints, anonymous tips, complaints about the social club that had been dismissed as paranoia. It's like this whole town was complicit, Briggs muttered, lighting his third cigarette of the evening. They knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to face it. Secrets thrive in the dark, Harrington said, flipping through another file, and Blackwood seems to have more than its fair share. A sudden thought struck him. What about Mayfair's businesses? If he was involved in shady deals, there might be records, ledgers, contracts, something that ties everything together. Briggs nodded. The lumber mill's still standing. It's been abandoned since his death, but no one's touched it. Harrington stood, grabbing his coat. Then that's where I'm going. The lumber mill was a hulking structure on the outskirts of town, its silhouette looming against the faint glow of the moon. The windows were shattered, the walls streaked with rust and grime. Harrington parked a distance away, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he approached. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of sawdust and decay. Harrington moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Old machinery stood like relics of a forgotten era, their once shiny surfaces now coated in dust. He found the office on the second floor, its door hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, the desk was covered in papers, most of them faded with age. Harrington sifted through them, his flashlight revealing numbers, names, dates. And then he found it, a ledger, its leather cover cracked but intact. The entries were meticulous, detailing payments made to various individuals. Harrington recognized some of the names, Calloway, Vance, Langley. But there were others, unfamiliar ones, each marked with a symbol, a small drawing of a rose. He flipped to the last few pages, his breath catching as he saw the name, the gardener. Next to it was a payment marked with an asterisk and a single note. Final installment. Contract complete. Harrington stared at the entry, the weight of its implications sinking in. The gardener wasn't just a vigilante, they'd been hired, and whoever had paid them was still out there. A faint noise behind him snapped Harrington out of his thoughts. He turned, his flashlight sweeping the room, but he saw nothing. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Someone was here. Harrington moved quickly, descending the stairs and heading for the exit. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, deliberate and measured. He reached the door, stepping into the night, and turned to face his pursuer. The man in the hat stood at the edge of the shadows, his face obscured. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the fog swirling between them. "Who are you?" Harrington demanded, his voice steady. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand, revealing a single silver thorn. He dropped it onto the ground, the faint clang breaking the silence, before turning and disappearing into the fog. Harrington didn't follow. He picked up the thorn, its inscription catching the moonlight. The gardener's work is never done. Harrington tightened his grip on the thorn, determination hardening his resolve. The gardener's work might not be done, but neither was his. End of Chapter 4. The Silverthorn Murderers, Chapter 5, Beneath the Roots. The morning broke with the sound of rain tapping against the hotel window. Harrington stared out at the street below, the fog no longer a presence but a memory, replaced by the gray drizzle that seemed determined to wash Blackwood clean. If only it could. His fingers toyed with the silver thorn he'd retrieved from the lumber mill the night before, the words etched into its surface haunting him. The gardener's work is never done. The man in the hat had shown himself, but only briefly, as if daring Harrington to catch him. The ledger he'd found at the mill sat open on the desk behind him, its entries damning enough to tie the Blackwood Social Club to something sinister, but vague enough to keep the full truth just out of reach. The gardener's name appeared frequently, always connected to payments marked with a rose symbol. The final entry, dated shortly before Albert Mayfair's death, hinted at a contract completed. But if the gardener had been hired to do something, why were they now killing the very people they'd worked for? Sheriff Briggs was waiting for him at the diner, his usual plate of eggs untouched. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn. "You look like you didn't sleep either," Harrington said, sliding into the booth. "Hard to sleep when you know a killer's out there, leaving thorns for people like breadcrumbs," Briggs replied, lighting a cigarette. "You find anything at the mill?" "Plenty," Harrington said, pulling the ledger from his bag. He opened it to the final pages and slid it across the table. The gardener wasn't just targeting the social club. They were hired by them. Briggs's brow furrowed as he scanned the entries. Hired for what? That's the question, Harrington said. Whatever it was big enough to justify payments to a mystery figure. And those payments stopped right before Mayfair's death. Briggs exhaled a long stream of smoke. You think Mayfair's death wasn't natural? I think it's worth considering, Harrington replied. The gardener's name keeps coming up, tied to all these men. If Mayfair was their last client, maybe he became their first victim. Briggs nodded grimly. So what do we do now? We follow the money, Harrington said. This ledger is a roadmap, and every name in it is a potential lead. Their first stop was one of Mayfair's former businesses, a restaurant called the Velvet Rose. The name struck Harrington as fitting, given the theme of roses and thorns that seemed to run through everything in this case. The building was closed, its windows boarded up, but the front door opened easily with a twist of Briggs's master key. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and stale grease. The dining room was eerily intact, as if the place had closed suddenly and never reopened. Harrington moved toward the office at the back, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The desk was bare, its drawers empty save for a few old menus and receipts, but behind the desk, the paneling on the wall seemed off. Harrington ran his fingers along the edge until he found a seam. He pressed, and the panel popped open, revealing a hidden safe. Looks like Mayfair liked his secrets, Briggs muttered. Let's hope they're still here, Harrington said, retrieving a small toolkit from his bag. It took him several minutes to crack the safe, but when it finally opened, the contents did not disappoint. Inside were stacks of papers, a ledger similar to the one from the mill, and a small wooden box. Harrington took the box first, opening it to reveal another silver thorn. This one, however, was different. Its inscription read, "The first bloom is the sweetest." Harrington frowned, turning it over in his hands. Another message. Briggs examined it closely. What does it mean? Not sure yet, Harrington admitted, setting it aside and turning his attention to the papers. Most were mundane financial records, invoices, but one letter caught his eye. It was handwritten, signed with a single initial. E.G. Harrison, Albert. The petals are falling. You've sown the seeds, and now it's time to reap. Ensure that the others remain silent, or the garden will be uprooted. G. Harrington passed the letter to Briggs. It's the gardener. Mayfair was covering something up for the club. Something big. And when he failed, Briggs asked. The gardener decided to clean house, Harrington said grimly. Their next stop was the home of Evelyn Mayfair, Albert's widow. The house was modest compared to the Calloway estate, but it was well kept, with a garden that looked meticulously tended despite the rain. Evelyn answered the door in a crisp blouse and cardigan, her gray hair pinned neatly back. Her sharp eyes softened slightly when she saw Briggs. Sheriff, she said, stepping aside to let them in. I wasn't expecting company. We appreciate your time, Mrs. Mayfair, Briggs said. This is Detective Harrington. He's investigating the recent murders. Evelyn's expression hardened. Awful business, that. Poor James and Harold. They were good men. Were they close with your husband? Harrington asked, taking a seat in the small but tidy living room. Very, Evelyn said. Albert considered them his closest friends. They were always meeting at the house, talking about the club. And what about the gardener? Harrington asked. Evelyn froze, her teacup hovering midair. Where did you hear that name? It's come up in my investigation, Harrington said carefully. Did your husband ever mention them? Evelyn set the cup down, her hands trembling slightly. Not by name, but I knew there was someone the club relied on. Albert never told me much, but I overheard things. He was scared, Detective. Toward the end, he started drinking more, staying up late, pacing the house. Did he say why? Harrington asked. He said the club had made a mistake, Evelyn said. Something they couldn't undo. And he said the gardener wouldn't stop until they paid for it. Do you know what the mistake was? Harrington pressed. Evelyn shook her head. tears welling in her eyes. I wish I did. Maybe I could have helped him. But he wouldn't talk to me. Not about the club, not about the gardener. He just said it was too dangerous. Harrington reached into his bag and pulled out the thorn from the safe. Have you ever seen this before? Evelyn's eyes widened. Albert had one, just like that. He kept it in his office, said it was a reminder of what they'd done. What they'd done, Harrington repeated, the weight of her words sinking in. Did he ever tell you what that meant? No, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. But whatever it was, it killed him. The rain had stopped by the time Harrington and Briggs left the Mayfair house, but the sky remained gray and heavy. Harrington leaned against the hood of the patrol car, his mind racing. This is bigger than I thought, he said. The social club didn't just make bad deals. They did something they knew could come back to haunt them. Something worth killing for, Briggs added. But what? That's what we need to find out, Harrington said, pulling out the ledger from the restaurant. We've got names, payments, and now a connection to the gardener. If we can figure out what the club was hiding, we'll know why they're being targeted. And who's next? Briggs said grimly. Harrington nodded. We need to talk to the mayor again. He's our only surviving link to the club. Thaddeus Langley wasn't happy to see them. The mayor's office was cluttered with papers, his tie loosened and his face pale. What now? He asked, sinking into his chair. We need answers, Harrington said, placing the thorn from Mayfair's safe on the desk. What does this mean? The first bloom is the sweetest. Langley's eyes flickered to the thorn, then away. I don't know. Don't lie to me, Harrington snapped. You were part of this. You and the others sowed the seeds, and now the gardener is reaping them. What was the club involved in? Langley's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water. It was a land deal, he said finally. Years ago, there was a piece of property the club wanted to develop, prime real estate on the edge of town. But the family that owned it wouldn't sell. What happened? Harrington asked, his voice cold. They disappeared, Langley said, his voice barely audible. Albert handled it. He said it was taken care of. And the gardener, Harrington pressed. Albert said they were. Insurance, Langley said, to make sure the family stayed gone. Harrington's blood ran cold. And now the gardener's come back. Langley nodded, his face ashen. To make us pay. Harrington left the office in a storm of anger and determination. The gardener wasn't just targeting the social club. They were delivering justice for the family that had been wronged. And as Harrington climbed into the car, he realized the most chilling truth of all. The gardener wasn't just avenging the past. They were still planting seeds, ensuring the future would bloom with vengeance. The thorns weren't finished yet. End of Chapter 5. The Silverthorn Murderers, Chapter 6, the final scene. The rain had returned by the time Harrington reached the sheriff's office. It drummed against the windows, muffling the sound of his footsteps as he entered. Briggs was at his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his face drawn tight with frustration. He glanced up as Harrington walked in, motioning for him to wait. Yes, I understand, Briggs said into the receiver, his voice laced with impatience. But you need to get someone out there. We can't afford to wait. He hung up and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. What's going on? Harrington asked, dropping his coat onto the nearby rack. Another message, Briggs said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. Delivered to Mayor Langley's house this morning. Harrington picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he read the neatly handwritten note. Thaddeus, the final petal falls tonight. Prepare for the harvest, the gardener. Langley's the next target, Harrington said, his mind already racing. Looks that way, Briggs replied. He's holed up in his house with half the force guarding him. But if the gardener wants him dead, I'm not sure it'll matter. Harrington frowned, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. The gardener had proven methodical and relentless, striking without warning and leaving no trace. But this time was different. They had announced their intentions, given Langley time to prepare. They want us to watch, Harrington said quietly. What do you mean? Briggs asked. The gardener doesn't just kill, they send a message, Harrington explained. This isn't about Langley anymore. It's about what he represents. The social club, their secrets, their sins. They want this to be public. Then what the hell do we do? Briggs asked. We figure out how they're planning to strike, Harrington said, and we stop them before they do. The first place Harrington checked was Langley's property itself. The mayor's house was a sprawling colonial-style home at the edge of town, surrounded by a wrought iron fence and meticulously trimmed hedges. Patrol cars were stationed at every corner, and uniformed officers paced the perimeter. Langley met Harrington in his study, the room dimly lit by a single desk lamp. The mayor looked worse than the last time Harrington had seen him, his hair unkempt, his shirt wrinkled, and his hands trembling as he nursed a glass of whiskey. "They're going to kill me, aren't they?" Langley asked, his voice hollow. "Not if I can help it," Harrington said, his tone firm. "Tell me everything you know about the gardener. Every detail, no matter how small." Langley sighed, setting the glass down. "I've told you everything. They were a tool, a way to handle problems the club couldn't deal with openly. Albert was the one who brought them in, said they were the best." "And what about the family?" Harrington pressed. "The ones who disappeared?" Langley's face paled. "That was Albert, too. He didn't tell us the details, just that the gardener had taken care of it." "But you knew," Harrington said, his voice sharp. "You knew something terrible had happened, and you let it go." Langley didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the floor. Harrington leaned closer. "If the gardener is coming for you, it's because they believe you were complicit. If you want to survive, you need to help me stop them." Langley looked up, his eyes filled with desperation. "I don't know how." Harrington stood, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Then pray we figure it out before it's too late." Harrington spent the next few hours combing through the property with Briggs, searching for anything that might indicate how the gardener planned to strike. The patrols were thorough, but something felt off, too quiet, too controlled. Harrington couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't until he reached the garden at the back of the house that he found something unusual. The ground, freshly tilled in a neat square, drew his attention. Kneeling, he brushed away the loose dirt, revealing a single silver thorn buried beneath the surface. Its inscription was chillingly simple. "The harvest is near." Harrington stood, his pulse quickening. "They've been here." Briggs joined him, his expression dark. "When?" "Recently," Harrington said. "They left this for us to find." "What does it mean?" Briggs asked. "It means they're already inside," Harrington said grimly. The realization hit like a freight train. Harrington ran back into the house, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The officers stationed inside looked at him in confusion, but he didn't stop to explain. Langley was upstairs, still in his study, and Harrington took the steps 2 at a time to reach him. The door was ajar when he arrived, and his worst fears were confirmed. The room was empty, the window open, rain splattering onto the hardwood floor. "Langley!" Harrington shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Briggs appeared behind him, his hand on his holster. "What happened?" "They took him," Harrington said, his fist clenched. "They were never going to kill him here. They wanted him somewhere else." Briggs swore under his breath. "Where?" Harrington's mind raced. The gardener's methods were precise, symbolic. Every move they made was tied to the social club, their crimes, their secrets, and then it hit him. "The garden," Harrington said. "Not this one. The one where it all began." Briggs frowned. "The Calloway estate?" Harrington nodded. "That's where they'll finish it." The drive to the Calloway estate was tense, the rain pounding against the windshield. Harrington gripped the wheel tightly, his thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. If Langley was still alive, the gardener's plan wasn't complete, but time was running out. The estate was dark when they arrived, the grand house looming like a shadow against the stormy sky. Harrington and Briggs moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way to the garden. What they found stopped them both in their tracks. Langley was tied to a wooden chair in the center of the rose garden, his head slumped forward. Surrounding him were roses, their petals glistening red, not from dew but from blood. A single silver thorn was embedded in the arm of the chair, its inscription glowing faintly in the light. The roots run deep. Sure, you. Harrington approached slowly, his heart pounding. Langley! The mayor stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He was alive but barely. Blood dripped from a shallow cut across his forehead, and his breathing was labored. They're still here, Langley whispered, his voice hoarse. Harrington turned, his flashlight sweeping the garden. The storm masked any sound, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Show yourself, Harrington shouted, his voice cutting through the rain. A figure stepped out from the shadows, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. They held a small knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. You've come far, detective, the gardener said, their voice calm but edged with menace. But this is where it ends. It doesn't have to, Harrington said, his hand hovering near his holster. We can talk about this. There's nothing left to talk about, the gardener replied. The social club destroyed lives, uprooted families. They thought they could escape justice, but justice has deep roots. And what about the people you've killed, Harrington asked. What about Langley? Does killing him bring those families back? The gardener tilted their head as if considering the question. No, but it ensures the club's sins are never forgotten. The knife glinted as the gardener moved closer, and Harrington knew he had to act. His hand shot to his holster, drawing his revolver and leveling it at the figure. Don't, Harrington warned. The gardener hesitated, their posture shifting slightly. In that moment, Briggs stepped forward, his gun drawn. It's over, Briggs said. For a moment, the only sound was the rain. Then the gardener dropped the knife, the blade sinking into the wet earth. You're too late, they said quietly. The seeds have already been sown. Harrington moved quickly, securing the gardener's hands with cuffs. We'll see about that. As they led the gardener away, Harrington couldn't shake their final words. What seeds had been sown, and what would grow from them? The answers he knew were still buried deep. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7, The Roots of Truth. The heavy wooden door of the sheriff's office closed behind Harrington, with a thud as he stepped into the damp morning air. The storm had passed, leaving a fresh layer of mist over Blackwood. The truth about the Wright family weighed on him, but even more so did the actions of the social club and the gardener. As the pieces began to fit together, the question of justice loomed larger than ever. Inside, Sheriff Briggs poured 2 cups of coffee, his hands steady despite the long night they had endured. You've been quiet, he said, sliding 1 cup across the desk to Harrington. That's not like you. Harrington took a sip of the bitter coffee, staring at the files and photos spread across the table. The gardener's story makes sense, but it doesn't excuse what they've done. Briggs nodded, taking a seat opposite him. Murder's murder, no matter how you dress it up. But if they hadn't done it, would anyone have ever known the truth? That's the problem, Harrington said. The social club buried their crimes so deep that it took blood to uncover them. Now the town sees the gardener as some kind of avenger. People love a vigilante, Briggs said grimly, until they don't. The interrogation room was silent, except for the faint hum of the overhead light. The gardener sat still, their hands resting lightly on the table. Harrington stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He placed the Wright family's file on the table, its contents spilling slightly from the edges. Tell me about the Wrights, Harrington said, his tone sharper than before. I want to know everything. The gardener tilted their head, their eyes scanning his face. You already know what happened. I know the social club drove them off their land, Harrington said. I know they disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and I know you've spent 20 years trying to avenge them. But I want to hear it from you. The gardener's expression hardened. Matthew and Claire Wright were good people. They worked hard, lived honestly. Their land was their livelihood, and they loved it. But the club saw it as a barrier and obstacle to their plans. And they made it disappear, Harrington said, his voice low. They tried to buy them out, the gardener replied. Offered them money, incentives, promises of a better future. But Matthew wouldn't sell. He knew what that land meant, not just to him, but to his family. What happened next? Harrington asked. The gardener leaned back slightly, their gaze distant. When money didn't work, they turned to intimidation. Threats, property damage, poisoning their livestock. The rights held firm, but it took a toll on them. And then they disappeared, Harrington said. Yes, the gardener said, their voice bitter. One night they were gone. No note, no warning. The official story was that they left voluntarily, but anyone who knew them knew that was a lie. Harrington narrowed his eyes. And you were close to them? Claire was my sister, the gardener said softly. Her children were my niece and nephew. When they vanished, I lost everything. Outside the interrogation room, Briggs stood watching through the one-way glass, his expression unreadable. The gardener's story was compelling, but it was also incomplete. Harrington joined him, running a hand through his hair. They're holding back, Harrington said. There's something they're not telling us. Like what? Briggs asked. Like what happened to the rights after they disappeared, Harrington replied. The social club didn't just make them leave. They erased them. Briggs frowned. You think the gardener knows more than they're letting on? I do, Harrington said, and I'm going to find out. Harrington spent the next several hours combing through old records, searching for any mention of the Wright family after their disappearance. Most of the files were unhelpful, vague reports of relocation and closed investigations. But one document caught his attention. It was a letter addressed to the Blackwood mayor at the time, detailing an anonymous tip about suspicious activity on the Wright property shortly after their disappearance. Harrington read it aloud to Briggs, who leaned over his shoulder. Excavation equipment was spotted on the Wright property in the weeks following their departure, Harrington recited. Witnesses reported seeing trucks entering and leaving the area at night. No official inquiry was made. Briggs cursed under his breath. They buried something out there. Or someone, Harrington said grimly. The Wright property was eerily quiet as Harrington and Briggs arrived, the sun dipping low in the sky. The overgrown fields and dilapidated farmhouse seemed frozen in time, untouched since the family had vanished. Harrington stepped out of the car, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. This place gives me the creeps, Briggs muttered, shining his flashlight across the property. Harrington didn't respond, his focus fixed on the map from the lumber mill. It marked several locations on the Wright property, each one annotated with cryptic notes. One site labeled Route caught his attention. Over here, Harrington said, leading Briggs toward the location marked on the map. They found themselves in a clearing surrounded by tall grass and scattered debris. The ground here was uneven, as if it had been disturbed long ago. Harrington knelt, brushing aside the weeds and dirt to reveal something metallic, a rusted shovel. This is it, Harrington said, his voice tight. This is where they buried the truth. With the help of a patrol team, Harrington and Briggs began excavating the site. It was slow, grueling work, the damp earth clinging to their tools. Hours passed before they finally uncovered something, a small wooden crate, weathered and rotting. Harrington pried it open carefully, his heart pounding. Inside were documents, photographs, and a single rusted pistol. The documents detailed the social club's plans for the Wright property, including the steps they had taken to secure it. But it was the photographs that stopped Harrington cold. They showed the Wright family, Matthew, Claire, Sophie, and Daniel, posed in front of their farmhouse. In the next photo, the family was bound and gagged, their expressions frozen in terror. The final photograph showed the Wrights lying in a shallow grave, the earth partially covering their lifeless bodies. Harrington felt a wave of nausea, his grip tightening on the edge of the crate. They killed them! Briggs swore under his breath, his face pale. Those bastards! This is what the gardener has been carrying, Harrington said, his voice shaking. This is the weight they've been bearing. Back at the sheriff's office, Harrington placed the photographs in front of the gardener. For the first time, their calm demeanor cracked. Their eyes filled with tears as they reached out, their hands trembling. "You found them," the gardener whispered. "We did," Harrington said, "and now the world will know." The gardener looked up, their expression a mix of sorrow and relief. "They deserved better than this." Harrington nodded. "They did. And now it's time to finish this." The next morning, Harrington held a press conference presenting the evidence against the social club to the public. The photographs, the documents, the ledger, they were all laid bare, the full extent of the club's corruption exposed. The town was stunned. Blackwood, once so proud of its history, now found itself grappling with the dark truth that had been hidden for decades. The Wright family became a symbol of the cost of greed and silence, their story a call for accountability and justice. The gardeners, still in custody, watched the broadcast from their cell. For the first time in 20 years, they felt a measure of peace. The seeds they had sown had finally bloomed. As Harrington prepared to leave Blackwood, he stopped by the Wright property one last time. The clearing where the photographs had been found was now marked with a simple wooden sign, "In memory of the Wright family. May they rest in peace." Harrington placed a single rose on the ground, the petals bright against the dark soil. The truth had been unearthed, but the scars it left would take years to heal. As he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the gardener's final words. The seeds have already been sown. What would grow from them, only time would tell. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Bloom of Truth. The trial of the gardener was a spectacle unlike anything Blackwood had ever seen. The courthouse, normally a quiet place of small-town disputes and minor infractions, now bustled with reporters, curious onlookers, and legal teams far more sophisticated than the usual fare. It seemed everyone wanted a piece of the story, whether to condemn or celebrate the gardener's actions. For Harrington, who had returned to observe the proceedings, the trial was a strange and uneasy experience. The gardener sat at the defense table, their demeanor calm as if they were merely a witness to their own judgment. The prosecution painted them as a calculated killer, while the defense leaned heavily on the systemic failures of the town's institutions, arguing that the gardener had acted out of necessity in a world that had ignored justice. Day 1. The case against the gardener. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the facts. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Veronica Chase, began with the murders. "James Calloway, Harold Vance, Albert Mayfair," she said, gesturing to photographs of the men displayed on an easel. 3 men who were tied together by their membership in the Blackwood Social Club, and 3 men who met their end at the hands of the defendant. She turned to face the jury. The gardener didn't just kill these men. They planned it. They left behind messages, taunts designed to terrorize not only the victims, but the entire town. She held up one of the silver thorns, its inscription glinting under the fluorescent lights. "This isn't justice. This is vengeance." The prosecution presented evidence collected during Harrington's investigation. The ledger from Mayfair's office, the letters, and the physical evidence tying the gardener to the murders. Witnesses testified to the gardener's calculated methods, including the eerie precision with which they had left their clues. For many in the courtroom, the gardener's actions seemed clear-cut, cold-blooded murder cloaked in moral ambiguity. Day 2, the defense. If the prosecution's case had been clear and methodical, the defense's approach was emotional and incendiary. The lead defense attorney, a charismatic man named Daniel Reed, leaned heavily into the corruption of the social club and the town's complicity in their crimes. "This is not a trial about murder," Reed began, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "This is a trial about a system that failed, a system that allowed the Blackwood Social Club to operate with impunity for decades, a system that ignored the plight of the Wright family and countless others." He gestured to the audience, many of whom nodded along. The gardener did what no one else would. They stood up to power. They exposed the truth. And yes, they took lives, but only after the system left them with no other choice. The defense called several witnesses, including Eleanor Calloway. Her testimony was a turning point in the trial. "My husband was not an innocent man," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "He made choices that hurt people, choices I didn't understand until it was too late. The gardener forced us all to confront what we'd ignored for too long." Harrington takes the stand. On the third day, Harrington was called to testify. The courtroom fell silent as he took the stand, his reputation preceding him. The prosecutor began. "Detective Harrington," Chase said, pacing in front of him, "you were instrumental in uncovering the truth about the social club. Do you believe that truth would have come to light without the gardener's actions?" Harrington considered his words carefully. No, the social club had buried their secrets deep, and they had the power to keep them buried. Without the gardener, the Wright family's story would have remained hidden. "And yet," Chase pressed, "the gardener committed murder. Do you condone their actions?" "No," Harrington said firmly. "Murder is never justified. The gardener exposed the truth, but they also took justice into their own hands. That's not how the law works." The defense attorney rose for cross-examination. "Detective Harrington, you've said the law failed the Wright family. Is that correct?" "Yes," Harrington replied. "And when you discovered the social club's crimes, did you find any evidence that anyone, law enforcement, town officials, attempted to hold them accountable?" Harrington hesitated. "No, there were attempts to investigate, but they were shut down." "So," Reed said, his voice rising, "if the law failed to bring justice, what choice did the gardener have?" Harrington's jaw tightened. "The gardener had a choice. We all do." Reed stepped closer. "And when the law abandons justice, detective, whose side are you on?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The gardener's testimony. On the fourth day, the gardener themselves took the stand. Their calm demeanor unnerved the room as they recounted the events that had led them to take up the mantle of vengeance. "The Wright family was everything to me," they began, their voice steady but filled with quiet grief. "Claire was my sister. Her children were my niece and nephew. When they vanished, I begged for answers, but no one would help me. The social club was too powerful. They owned the town." They paused, their gaze sweeping the room. "I waited for years, hoping the truth would come out, but it didn't, so I made a choice. If no one else would deliver justice, I would." "And the murders," the prosecutor pressed. "Why kill these men?" "They were the roots of the corruption," the gardener replied. "Their hands were stained with the blood of the Wright family and countless others. I didn't just kill them. I made sure the town knew why."
The verdict.
After days of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 tense days before reaching a verdict. The courthouse was packed as the foreman read it aloud. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." A murmur rippled through the room, a mix of relief and disappointment. The judge, acknowledging the complexity of the case, sentenced the gardener to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a compromise that satisfied few, but reflected the nuance of the situation. Harrington left the courtroom as reporters swarmed the steps, their questions blending into an unintelligible cacophony. He didn't need to hear the headlines to know what they would say. The gardener had been condemned, but their legacy would linger. The aftermath. In the weeks following the trial, Blackwood struggled to reconcile its past with its present. The Wright family's story became a rallying cry for justice, and efforts were made to restore their property as a memorial. The social club's name was forever tarnished, its remaining members either disgraced or in hiding. Eleanor Calloway left town, seeking solace far from the shadows of her husband's sins. Sheriff Briggs retired, his once steady demeanor worn thin by the revelations that had shaken the town. For Harrington, the case left a mark he couldn't shake. Back in his city apartment, he reviewed the evidence one last time before packing it away. A single rose pressed between the pages of his notebook served as a reminder of the truth he'd uncovered and the cost of bringing it to light. A letter from the gardener. If you're nothing, listen. One quiet evening, Harrington received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter, the familiar script unmistakable. Detective Harrington, the seeds have bloomed, but the garden is far from finished. You saw the truth for what it was, and for that I thank you. But remember this, every garden needs tending, and every truth has its thorns. Until we meet again, G. Harrington placed the letter in his desk, its weight heavier than the paper it was written on. The gardener's words lingered, a reminder that the fight for justice was never truly over. As he stared out at the city lights, Harrington knew one thing for certain. The roots of corruption ran deep, and though one garden had been uprooted, others would take its place. The question was whether he'd be ready when the time came. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9, The Harvest. Blackwood had changed. The once quiet town, where secrets had been nurtured and buried under layers of power and influence, now found itself exposed to the harsh glare of truth. The trial of the gardener, the exposure of the Blackwood Social Club's crimes, and the legacy of the Wright family had transformed the community. But change was rarely smooth, and in Blackwood, it came with thorns. Miles Harrington, though no longer officially part of the case, couldn't resist lingering a little longer. He had returned to Blackwood not out of obligation, but out of curiosity and perhaps a sense of unfinished business. The case, with all its revelations and moral ambiguities, had lodged itself firmly in his mind. The town grapples with the truth. The Wright family story became the focal point of Blackwood's reckoning. Their land, once sought after for profit and development, was now a symbol of justice delayed and lives lost. A community fundraiser was organized to restore the property, transforming it into a memorial park. The project was spearheaded by a coalition of town residents, many of whom had ignored or enabled the social club's actions in the past. "It's the least we can do," said Sarah Bell, a local business owner and one of the organizers. "We can't undo what happened, but we can honor their memory." The initiative sparked mixed feelings in Harrington. While it was heartening to see the town take steps toward accountability, he couldn't ignore the years of complicity that had allowed the social club to thrive. This was a town that had turned a blind eye to its darker elements until the gardener had forced it to look. Eleanor Calloway's farewell. Eleanor Calloway packed her belongings into a small moving van, the last vestiges of her life in Blackwood, boxed up and ready to leave. She had sold the Calloway estate, unable to bear the weight of the memories it carried. Harrington stopped by on her last day in town, finding her in the garden, staring at the roses that had once been her pride. "It's strange," Eleanor said as Harrington approached. "I used to think these roses were a symbol of beauty and control, but now I see them for what they are, fragile, temporary." Harrington stood beside her, his hands in his coat pockets. "You've been through a lot, Eleanor. Leaving might be the best thing for you." She nodded, her eyes never leaving the flowers. "Do you think he would have changed, Miles? If he'd lived, would James have faced the truth?" Harrington hesitated. "I don't know, but I think he was starting to see the cost of what he'd done." Eleanor sighed, wiping a tear from her cheek. "It's too late for him, but not for me. I have to find a new path." She turned to Harrington, offering a faint smile. "Thank you for everything, for uncovering the truth even when it hurt." Harrington nodded, watching as she walked away from the garden for the last time. Sheriff Briggs retires. Sheriff Briggs's office had always been a cluttered space, filled with old case files, photographs, and personal mementos. On his final day, Harrington found him packing a box of belongings, his expression weary but resolute. "You sure about this?" Harrington asked, leaning against the doorframe. Briggs looked up and smirked. "I've been sure about this for years, just didn't have the guts to do it until now." Harrington stepped inside, sitting on the edge of the desk. "The town needs someone like you, Briggs. Someone who's seen the worst of it and still cares." Briggs shrugged. "Maybe, but it's time for someone else to take over. Someone who isn't carrying all this baggage. Harrington gestured to the files still spread across the desk. What about the unfinished business? Briggs's smirk faded. It's always unfinished, Miles. You know that better than anyone. As Harrington left the office, he realized how much Briggs had carried, not just the weight of his own choices, but the choices of an entire town. Blackwood was losing a good man, but maybe that was part of its healing process too. The gardener's legacy. While the town worked to rebuild, the gardener remained in custody, awaiting their transfer to a state prison. Their trial had made them a divisive figure, both a symbol of vengeance and a cautionary tale. For some, they were a hero who had brought long-buried truths to light. For others, they were a murderer who had undermined the very foundations of justice. Harrington visited them one last time before they were moved. The interrogation room was as stark and cold as ever, but the gardener seemed unbothered, their calm demeanor intact. "You've changed this town," Harrington said as he sat across from them. "But at what cost?" The gardener smiled faintly. "The cost was never mine to bear, Detective. It was always theirs." "You don't regret any of it?" Harrington asked. The gardener shook their head. "No, because the truth needed to bloom, and now it has." Harrington leaned forward, his gaze steady. "What about the seeds you planted? What happens to them?" "That's not up to me," the gardener said. "I've done my part. Now it's up to Blackwood to decide what grows." The Wright Memorial Park. The opening of the Wright Memorial Park was a somber but hopeful event. A plaque at the entrance bore the names of the Wright family, along with a simple inscription, "May the truth bloom forever." Harrington attended the ceremony, standing in the back as the Mayor Langley's replacement delivered a heartfelt speech about accountability and healing. The park was beautiful, its pathways lined with roses that had been transplanted from the Callaway estate. For the first time in decades, the Wright family's land was at peace. The final letter. Months later, Harrington returned to his city apartment, ready to put the case behind him. But as he sifted through his mail one evening, a familiar handwriting caught his eye. The letter was unmarked, but he knew who it was from. "Detective Harrington, the garden has been tended, but its roots remain. What grows next will depend on the care it receives. You saw the truth for what it was, and for that I am grateful. But remember, every garden needs its gardener. Until next time, G." Harrington stared at the letter, the weight of its words settling over him. The gardener might have been removed from Blackwood, but their influence lingered. The seeds they had sown had already begun to sprout, and it was up to the town, and perhaps Harrington himself, to ensure that what grew was worth tending. After Harrington's reflection. As he folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, Harrington found himself thinking about Blackwood, about the Wrights, about the gardener. The case had left its mark on him, not just as a detective, but as a person. He glanced at the frame rose on his bookshelf, a keepsake from the Wright property. It was a reminder that truth, like a garden, required care, patience, and sometimes pain. And while Harrington had left Blackwood behind, he knew its lessons would stay with him forever. The gardener's work was done for now, but gardens never truly stopped growing, and neither did the search for justice. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10, The Last Bloom. The sun rose over Blackwood on the day the gardener was transferred to a maximum security prison. It cast a pale light over the town that had been forever changed by their actions. Miles Harrington watched from a distance as the sheriff's patrol car, carrying the gardener in its back seat, disappeared down the road. For a moment, the town felt still, like the final note of a song that had ended too soon. The trial, the revelations, and the town's reckoning had all played out like chapters in a story that Harrington couldn't close. Though the gardener's work was finished, their words lingered. Every garden needs a gardener. What had they meant? Was their work truly done, or had they planted something that would grow beyond their control? Blackwood's future. The Wright Memorial Park opened quietly, with little fanfare beyond the dedication ceremony. It was not just a memorial to the family, but to all the unspoken truths that Blackwood had hidden for so long. For the first time in decades, the town faced its past honestly, acknowledging the pain it had ignored. The park became a gathering place for the community. Children played where the Wright family had once walked, their laughter a bittersweet echo of what had been lost. Volunteers tended the roses transplanted from the Calloway estate, their petals vibrant against the backdrop of green fields. Each thorn was a reminder of the gardener's message. Beauty and pain often grew side by side. Yet even as the town moved forward, its scars remained. The gardener's trial had exposed more than just the social club's crimes. It had revealed the complicity of many who had turned a blind eye. Relationships were strained, and the trust that had once defined Blackwood felt fragile. Langley's downfall. Former Mayor Langley, once a pillar of the community, was now a pariah. Though he had survived the gardener's attempt on his life, his reputation was beyond repair. The trial had unearthed evidence of his role in the Wright family's demise, as well as his efforts to suppress investigations into the social club's activities. Langley spent his days in isolation, his grand home now a hollow shell of its former glory. Harrington visited him once before leaving town, curious to see the man who had once wielded so much power. Langley answered the door himself, his face gaunt and weary. "Detective," he said, his voice hollow. "Come to gloat?" "No," Harrington replied. "I came to ask why." Langley let out a bitter laugh, leading Harrington into the sitting room. The house was sparsely furnished now, many of its trappings sold to pay for legal fees. "Why does anyone do anything, Harrington? Greed, ambition, fear. Take your pick." "You could have stopped it," Harrington said, his tone firm. "The Wright family didn't have to die." Langley slumped into a chair, his gaze distant. "I told myself it was just business, that someone else would do it if I didn't. But the truth, I was too much of a coward to stand up to Mayfair or Calloway. And now, well, now it's too late." Harrington stood to leave, his chest heavy with the weight of Langley's admission. "It's never too late to do the right thing, Langley, even if it's just an apology." Langley didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the empty fireplace. The gardener's final words. Harrington couldn't shake the feeling that the gardener had more to say. Before they were transferred, he visited them one last time, finding them as calm and composed as ever. "You've achieved what you wanted," Harrington said, sitting across from them. "The social club is finished. The town knows the truth. So why does it feel like you're still holding something back?" The gardener smiled faintly, their hands folded neatly in front of them. "Because the truth is never complete, Detective. It's like a garden always growing, always changing. What you've seen is only the beginning." Harrington frowned. "The beginning of what?" The gardener tilted their head slightly. "Accountability, perhaps. Or maybe chaos. It depends on how Blackwood tends its garden." "And you?" Harrington asked. "Do you think you'll ever regret what you've done?" The gardener's expression softened. "Regret? No. But I wonder what the Wrights would think. Would they see justice or just more blood?" The question lingered as Harrington left the room, the gardener's calm gaze following him. Therefore, the letter. Months later, Harrington returned to his city apartment, ready to move on from the case. Yet the gardener's story continued to haunt him. One evening, as he sifted through his mail, he found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, the handwriting unmistakable. "Detective Harrington, the garden has been tended, but its roots remain. What grows next will depend on the care it receives. Thank you for helping the truth bloom. G." The letter was accompanied by a pressed rose, its petals faded but intact. Harrington stared at it for a long time, the weight of its symbolism pressing against his chest. The gardener had been removed from Blackwood, but their influence remained, woven into the fabric of the town story. After Harrington's reflection. Sitting at his desk, Harrington opened the case file one last time. The photographs of the Wright family, the ledger from Mayfair's office, the letters exchanged between the social club members, they all painted a picture of greed, corruption, and human failure. But they also told a story of resilience and the unrelenting pursuit of truth. He placed the gardener's letter alongside the others, then closed the file. It was over, at least for him. Blackwood would continue to grapple with its past, but Harrington had done his part. It returned to Blackwood. A year later, Harrington found himself back in Blackwood, drawn by a sense of unfinished business. The Wright Memorial Park had become a centerpiece of the town, its pathways filled with visitors who came to reflect on its meaning. Harrington walked its trails, pausing at the plaque that bore the family's names. May the truth bloom forever. As he stood there, a young boy ran past, laughing as he chased a butterfly. Harrington smiled faintly, the sight a reminder that even in the shadow of tragedy, life continued. He left the park with a sense of closure, knowing that while the scars of Blackwood's past would never fully heal, the town had taken its first steps toward a better future. Epilogue: The Next Gardener. In a small house on the edge of town, a woman knelt in her garden, her hands covered in dirt as she tended to a row of blooming roses. She paused, looking up as a shadow fell across her. A man in a dark coat stood at the edge of the garden, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "They'll need someone to keep them honest," the man said, his voice calm. "Are you ready?" The woman nodded, her expression resolute. "It's time for a new garden." The man handed her a single silver thorn, its inscription unreadable in the fading light. As he walked away, the woman placed the thorn among the roses, the seeds of a new story already taking root.
End of Chapter 10 and end of story.
Thank you for listening.
Make sure to check our other free audiobooks at 10 Chapters Audiobooks on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast.